About Matthew, and he was a supporter. I think the sad thing was, I think they went to Highbury, and there were a few of the crowd apparently were a little bit noisy. I think it was Highbury. I'm not sure. The Arsenal. I think that's sad, because he was a supporter. He loved his club, and in the end, he bought.
Peter Osgood was the king of Stamford Bridge, one of the most naturally gifted forwards England ever produced, a man who could do things with a football that made grown men stop breathing. But what if I told you that for all that talent, all that grace, all those nights when the crowd at Chelsea roared his name like a prayer, the game never really gave him what he deserved? 4 England caps. 4. For a player of that quality, that number isn't just low, it's an accusation. And on the morning of the 1st of March 2006, Peter Osgood left the world not on a football pitch, not surrounded by the people who'd adored him, but at a funeral, mourning someone else. He was 59. So how does a man that gifted end up that overlooked, that troubled and gone that soon? I am Oliver, and this is Sport Icons. He was born in 1947 in Windsor, and from the moment Chelsea's youth coaches got eyes on him, they knew they had something different on their hands. Not just a promising teenager, something genuinely rare. Osgood was tall, 2-footed, and elegant in a way you couldn't coach. He could receive the ball with his back to goal and make the defender behind him feel completely helpless. He could hold it up, turn and drive at pace, or slide a pass into a pocket of space most forwards wouldn't even see. He had every tool, and he used all of them with a nonchalance that made it look almost effortless. By the late 1960s, Chelsea were building something at Stamford Bridge that felt genuinely exciting, and Osgood was right at the centre of it. The FA Cup in 1970, the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1971. He wasn't just a participant in those victories, he was the heartbeat of them. In the 1970 FA Cup final replay against Leeds, he scored with a diving header that is still shown today as one of the finest cup final goals ever scored. That's the kind of footballer he was, the kind who delivered when it mattered most. The Stamford Bridge crowd didn't just cheer for Peter Osgood, they worshipped him. The King nickname wasn't a piece of terrace irony or an affectionate exaggeration. It captured something real. When he walked out onto that pitch, he carried himself like the place belonged to him, because in every way that mattered, it did. And the wider world around Chelsea in those years only added to the mythology. This was swinging London at full tilt. The King's Road was 2 minutes from the ground, and Chelsea were the glamour club of the era, the place where football met celebrity culture, where the game felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Osgood fit that world like he'd been designed for it. Charismatic, handsome, confident without being cruel, he was the right man in the right place at exactly the right moment. But there's always more to the story than the crown, because even in those glory years, when the goals were flowing and the trophies were arriving and the crowd was singing his name, the foundations weren't entirely solid. The same city that celebrated him also offered him everything a young man with money and fame and not enough guardrails could find. The parties, the late nights, the lifestyle that came bundled with being the king of the most glamorous football club in England. He never pretended otherwise. That honesty was part of who he was. But honesty about a problem and solving it are two very different things, and Osgood, for all his gifts, never quite managed to close that gap. The cracks were already forming behind the crown, and it only took one afternoon in October 1966 for everything to start shifting underneath him. October 1966, Chelsea versus Blackpool in a League Cup match. Osgood was 19 years old, already established in the first team, already the player the crowd had decided was their own. Then a tackle came in, and that was it. A horrific leg break that took him off the pitch and put him in a hospital bed for weeks, then a rehabilitation room for months, then a long, grinding period of uncertainty where nobody could tell him exactly how much of himself he'd get back. He missed nearly a full year of football at 19. But in the window when a forward like him should have been building momentum, sharpening his game, stacking appearances, becoming the player that England selectors couldn't ignore. Instead, he watched from the outside while his body slowly knitted itself back together, and he had nothing to do but think about everything he was missing. There's a particular kind of psychological damage that comes with a serious injury at that age. It's not just the physical pain, though that's real enough. It's the identity crisis underneath it. When football is the thing that defines you, the thing you've built your entire sense of self around, and then it's suddenly taken away, you're left with a question you've never had to answer before. Who are you without it? For a 19-year-old with Osgood's profile and Osgood's confidence, that question must have cut deeply. He came back, and the remarkable thing is, he came back well. He returned to Chelsea, found his form again, and went on to deliver some of the finest performances of his generation. The goals in those cup finals, the performances that made the Stamford Bridge crowd lose their minds. All of that came after the injury. On the surface, he looked like a man who'd recovered completely, but he admitted himself that he was never quite the same athlete. The explosive pace, the full physical authority he'd had before that tackle, it didn't fully come back. He compensated brilliantly with technique, with intelligence, with the two-footedness and the vision that no injury could touch. But the gap between what he was before October 1966 and what he was after it stayed with him quietly for the rest of his career, and England noticed, not consciously perhaps, and not with any clear statement of policy, but the selectors who should have been handing Osgood a run of caps and building a place for him in the national setup somehow always found a reason not to. 4 caps across a career of that quality is a number that demands an explanation. The injury, the lost momentum, the slight question mark over his physical peak. None of it was ever said out loud, but it shaped the verdict. He was good enough to survive the broken leg. What came next was harder to recover from. London in the late 1960s and early 1970s wasn't just a city, it was an invitation. And for a young man with Osgood's looks, his profile and his wage packet, the invitation came with no small print attached. The parties were always somewhere nearby. The gambling dens, the late bars, the circles where footballers and celebrities and people who just wanted to be near both of them all blurred together after midnight. Osgood didn't stumble into that world accidentally. He walked into it with the same confidence he brought to a football pitch. He liked it. He was good at it. The king of Stamford Bridge lived like royalty off the pitch too, and for a while he was charming enough and talented enough that nobody felt the need to stop him. The drinking became a thread that ran through everything. Not hidden, not denied. Osgood was always too honest for that, but never quite confronted either. He'd talk about the nights out with the same openness he'd talk about a goal. It was just part of the life, part of who he was, or at least that's how it looked from the outside. The problem with that framing is that it lets something genuinely damaging wear the costume of personality. Make sure to like and subscribe, and now back to the video. What it actually did, quietly and steadily, was close doors. England managers looked at the complete picture of Peter Osgood, the talent undeniable, the lifestyle well documented, and made a calculation. They couldn't trust what they'd get. A player who might turn up on Thursday not quite right, who carried the faint smell of the previous weekend into a training session, who made the selectors nervous in a way they couldn't always put into words, but felt clearly enough. So they picked someone else, then someone else again, and the caps stayed at 4 because the off-pitch version of him gave the men in charge the excuse they needed to look away. The cruel thing is that his teammates saw all of it. They saw the brilliant footballer, the touch, the movement, the way he could change a game from nothing. And they also saw the man who made life harder for himself than his talent ever should have required. Some of them tried to say something. Most of them didn't, because in that era, in that dressing room culture, you didn't. You looked after your own business and you let your teammates look after theirs. Even when you could see theirs was starting to unravel. There's a particular kind of tragedy in watching someone survive on talent alone for long enough that the damage underneath never gets properly addressed. Osgood was good enough to keep playing, keep scoring, keep drawing those long roars from the Stamford Bridge terraces, and that very fact made it easier for everyone, including him, to tell themselves there wasn't really a problem. When the goals are still going in, who's going to be the one to say stop? The genius and the self-destruction fed each other in a way that became harder to separate as the years went on. And because he could keep performing, the reckoning kept getting pushed further down the road. It caught up with him eventually, not in the way you might expect, and not all at once. But the fallout with Chelsea, when it came, had roots that stretched back through every one of those late nights. Chelsea through the mid-1970s were a club coming apart at the seams. The money had dried up, the squad was ageing, and the boardroom decisions that followed were the kind that kill supporter trust quickly and thoroughly. The club that had felt like the centre of the football universe just a few years earlier was suddenly selling players, cutting costs, and making enemies of the people who'd built what little legacy they had. Osgood was sold to Southampton in 1974. The official version was that it was a football decision, a financial necessity, the kind of difficult call that struggling clubs sometimes have to make. The supporters at Stamford Bridge saw it differently. To them, it felt like the club had handed their king out the door with barely a backward glance. The anger on the terraces was real, and it was pointed in Chelsea's direction, not his. Southampton wasn't a disaster. He linked up well there, and the football was decent enough. But it wasn't Stamford Bridge. It wasn't the place where 60,000 people knew every move he made before he made it, where the crowd had a specific raw reserve just for him. He tried a brief spell in the United States with Philadelphia Fury in 1978. chasing something, though it's hard to say exactly what. He came back to Chelsea briefly after that, a short return that felt more like sentiment than strategy, and then it was over. The deeper wound came later, during the Ken Bates era at Chelsea. Osgood had never been the type to hold his tongue when he felt something was wrong, and he said publicly what a lot of people connected to the club were saying privately, that the direction Bates was taking Chelsea wasn't right. The response was extraordinary. He was banned from Stamford Bridge. The king of the club, the man whose goals had brought them their greatest moments, was told he wasn't welcome on the ground he'd defined. There's no other way to frame that. It was a humiliation, and it was deliberate. Whatever the stated reason, the message underneath was clear enough. Loyalty ran one way, and Osgood had stepped outside it by speaking his mind. The ban was eventually lifted, but the damage it did to his relationship with the club didn't fully heal. You don't forget being locked out of the place that gave you everything. His later years kept him close to football in the only ways left available to him. Hospitality work, corporate days, the kind of arrangements where former players trade on their name and their stories to keep connected to a world that has largely moved on without them. He was generous with his time by all accounts. The charm that had lit up King's Road in the 1960s was still there, but it was a far cry from the stage he'd once owned. He carried all of it into 2006. The injury that had cost him his physical peak, the drinking that had cost him his England career, and the fallout with Chelsea that had cost him something harder to name. A sense of belonging, maybe, a place where the past still felt warm. He was still carrying it on the morning everything stopped. The firm March 2006 started as an ordinary morning. Osgood drove to a crematorium in Slough to attend his uncle's funeral. Not a public event, not a ceremony where anyone expected cameras or crowds. Just a family gathering, the quiet kind, the kind where you sit in a row and hold yourself together for someone else's grief. He collapsed during the service. A heart attack, sudden and without warning, in the middle of a room full of people who were already mourning. Paramedics arrived and got him to Wexham Park Hospital as fast as they could. It wasn't fast enough. Peter Osgood was pronounced dead that afternoon. He was 59 years old. There's something almost unbearable about the setting. A man who had lived at full volume, the goals, the headlines, the nights out, the fallouts, the roar of 60,000 people, taken in silence at a private ceremony while he was there to support somebody else. The world didn't get to prepare. His family didn't get to prepare. One moment he was there, and then he wasn't. Chelsea supporters found out the way you find out about things like that, through phone calls and radio bulletins and the slow-spreading word that something bad had happened. The tributes came quickly, and they came from everywhere. Former teammates, opponents who'd spent entire matches trying to stop him, supporters who'd never spoken to him, but felt the loss as personally as if they had. This wasn't the polite acknowledgement that follows a player dying in old age. It was genuine grief, unfiltered, the kind that catches you off guard because you never thought to brace for it. His family made one final decision that said everything. His ashes were buried beneath the penalty spot at Stamford Bridge. The king returned to his ground the only way that was left to him, and in doing so, settled permanently into the place he'd never really left. His ex-wife Lynn spoke in the years following his death about the man she'd known, privately. Not the legend the terraces celebrated, but the person who came home after the crowds had gone. What she described was someone generous and funny and deeply loyal, who also carried more than he ever said out loud. The lifestyle extracted a cost from the people closest to him that no highlight reel accounts for. 4 England caps. The football establishment never formally explained that number, and it never had to. But the gap between what Osgood produced at club level and what the national side ever trusted him to produce speaks clearly enough. The broken leg at 19 disrupted his momentum at exactly the wrong time. The drinking made selectors look elsewhere. The fallout with Chelsea cost him a safe landing back into the game's affections. Each thing alone might have been survivable. All 3 together quietly dismantled something that should have been untouchable. What's left, years on, is the honest admission that English football wasted a portion of what Peter Osgood had to offer. Not maliciously, not through a single decision anyone can point to, just through neglect and assumption and the comfortable habit of looking away from complicated men. His ashes sit beneath the Stamford Bridge penalty spot. That's where the king ended up. Not in a trophy cabinet, not in an England squad photo, just quietly beneath the ground where he was always most himself. The talent was never in question. Everything that surrounded it was. Leave your thoughts on Peter Osgood in the comments below, and if stories like this one matter to you, hit subscribe. There are plenty more where this came from.